The moment the galley doors hissed shut behind the guards, the human chef sealed them from the inside, turned to face the confused aliens, and cracked his neck. "No more takeout orders. Tonight I'm serving justice." That was the last thing they heard before the emergency lockdown engaged and the lights dimmed to blood red. The galley smelled like burnt oil, iron, and cooked defiance. Elias Ward, once the proud executive chef of a five-star kitchen in Manhattan, now stirred an industrial pot aboard an alien warship halfway across the galaxy. His apron was charred at the edges, his ladle bent from being used more as a club than a utensil, and his eyes scanned the room like a general assessing a battlefield. Around him, massive reptilian guards lounged in smugness, casually flinging food trays aside and laughing in garbled dialects at the primitive earthling, who slaved over heat and smoke to feed them. To them, he was harmless. A culinary curiosity. A living insult to their technology-driven cuisine of gel packs and nutrient cubes. They let him live not out of respect, but out of mockery. A mascot for a fallen race. A man who cooked because he was too weak to fight. But Elias was more than a cook. He had memorized every guard rotation, every weapon locker code, every ventilation shaft that passed through his kitchen. Where others saw pots and pans, Elias saw alloys and gas lines. Where others saw spice racks, he saw flammable compounds. He hadn't just been cooking meals. He'd been rehearsing battle. It had started with a mistake on their part. One of the lower-ranked guards, a burly creature named Chlor, had slipped on a puddle of grease and banged his head on a counter corner. The other guards laughed. Elias didn't. He watched how long it took for the guard to stand, how loud the thud echoed, how little the ship's internal sensors responded. That was the moment he knew. The ship was arrogant. And so were its masters. Later that cycle, a new shipment of rations arrived, tubes of protein paste and sealed tanks of high-density energy gel. But Elias noticed something strange. The usually smug delivery crew looked nervous. Their eyes darted to the lower decks. One whispered something about containment failure, and another shushed him immediately. Elias took mental notes. He never forgot a recipe, especially when it was made of fear. He began slipping questions into conversations, offering food in exchange for gossip. Aliens were prideful, and with enough salt and attention, they spilled more than just their drinks. One slip-up revealed that something was locked beneath the galley. A failed experiment. Something their own kind couldn't kill, so they buried it deep, beneath the human chef's stove. It was meant as a joke. They even broadcasted it on their Warfleet's entertainment stream. The only thing between the failed bioweapon and the crew above was a kitchen run by a man whose only weapon was a whisk. That joke would soon be their downfall. Elias didn't sleep. He stayed up watching how the vents pulsed every 4 hours. How the temperature dropped slightly before nutrient shipments. How long it took for guards to respond to loud noises. He started leaving minor hazards, wet floors, sharp ladles, and properly sealed containers. Nothing lethal. Just enough to test their attention. Just enough to make them underestimate him even more. Then came the captain's birthday. A lavish affair with demands for Earth-style cuisine and live entertainment. The guards jeered as Elias prepared steaks using modified plasma lines to sear the meat. He wore a smile and a chef's hat someone had mocked together from packaging foam. But inside, he was calculating everything. The placement of the guards. The structural vibrations of the deck. The scent of ionized metal in the air. When he flambéed the steak, the flames rose just high enough to trigger a micro-response from the fire suppression system. He wanted to confirm what gas it used. It was non-lethal, but flammable. As the celebration ended, a lieutenant named D-Rex leaned against the kitchen wall and sneered. "I don't know whether your food's worse than your planet or your face." Elias smiled and replied, "Careful. One day this kitchen might not let you out." D-Rex laughed, kicked over a pot, and stumbled out with the others. That was the last straw. He waited until the next shift, 4 guards, all lazy, all familiar. He served them a special dish. Rich in aroma, soft in color, and laced with trace elements extracted from the ship's own medical bay. Harmless at first. Then disorienting. Then paralyzing. He made sure not to use lethal doses. He wanted them alive. Scared. A message. The doors sealed with a clunk that echoed through the galley like a death bell. The guards turned in confusion as Elias walked toward them, apron fluttering behind him like a cape. The ship's automated voice chirped something in alien dialect. Elias had triggered the containment lock using an old biometric override from an injured tech officer he had once fed soup to. He had been kind to her. She told him secrets. And now, those secrets were in his hands. One of the guards lunged at him. Elias threw hot grease into the air, harmless but distracting. He ducked, rolled, and slammed a pot lid into the guard's exposed neck. It wasn't enough to kill, but it knocked him off balance. The others hesitated. This was new. This wasn't part of their training. Humans weren't supposed to fight back. But Elias wasn't just fighting. He was reclaiming. He backed toward the oven. It had been modified. He reached inside and pulled out what looked like a baking tray, but it was layered with sharpened ceramic shards from shattered food processors. He didn't charge. He stood still and spoke calmly. "This kitchen was my prison. But now it's your cage. And I'm done serving you." The guards growled. One drew a sidearm and aimed it. Elias hit a panel beside him. Steam burst from vents across the ceiling, thick and blinding. The gun fired, but the plasma bolt ricocheted off a heat-shielded pot rack. Chaos erupted. Outside the galley, alarms blinked once, then stopped. No one came running. No one cared. It was just the human cook. But inside that sealed room, the war had begun. And Elias had every ingredient he needed. The air inside the sealed galley grew heavier by the second, a swirling mix of steam, sizzling oil, and the sharp sting of fear. Elias moved like he belonged to the chaos, gliding between metal counters and shattered spice jars, each step planned, each breath measured. Behind him, one of the alien guards stumbled over a fallen pot, claws skidding across the slick floor, muscles spasming from the mild neurotoxins Elias had infused into the meal. It wasn't enough to kill. That wasn't the point. The goal was control. Confusion. To break their sense of superiority one twitching limb at a time. The others were still mobile but slower now, sluggish like old engines choked with dust. They blinked hard, trying to refocus in the red light that bathed the room, their predator instincts faltering under the weight of a threat they had never trained for. A human. A cook. With no armor, no plasma rifle, and no backup. Just an apron and a kitchen he'd turned into a trap. Elias stepped over a down ladle and reached under a supply rack, pulling out a small metal cylinder taped in rusted foil. It was a pressure capsule from the emergency hydration packs, repurposed, of course. Inside was a compound drawn from weeks of experimentation, mixed from alien spice residue, earth pepper extract, and trace energy gels. He tossed the capsule near the feet of the biggest guard, the one they called Groktel. It burst with a hiss, releasing a dense fog that slammed into the alien's nostrils like a chemical brick. Groktel roared and swung blindly, knocking over a prep table, but Elias was already gone, rolling low under the meat counter. He emerged on the other side with a metal skewer in one hand and a flattened food tray in the other. Groktel charged again, eyes weeping, breath ragged. He barreled forward, but Elias slid the tray across the floor like a curling stone, and the moment Groktel's foot landed on it, the grease sent him flying forward, arms flailing, before his head struck the fridge with a thud that made the entire room flinch. Silence followed. The two remaining guards hesitated. The loud one with the sharp tusks backed into a corner, muttering something in his own tongue. The other reached for a communicator, but Elias had already fried the signal relay. He did it during a routine stew preparation 2 weeks ago. No signals. No help. No escape. He picked up a glass jar and held it in the red glow, its contents murky and pulsing faintly. This was one of the most carefully built tools in his arsenal. He called it the ghost jar. Inside was a live bacterial culture he had siphoned from the alien waste disposal system, carefully cultivated into something foul-smelling but harmless. He popped the lid just enough to let the scent escape. The guard near the door gagged and collapsed, slipping into unconsciousness as the stink overwhelmed his senses. Elias kicked his weapon away and tied his claws using electrical cords from the cooking units. Now only one was left. The one in the corner, shivering, not from fear but from something worse, uncertainty. He didn't understand how this was happening. Elias approached slowly, no weapon in hand, just a wet towel soaked in vinegar and spice. The alien tried to snarl but only managed to croak. Elias didn't speak. He simply stepped close, wiped the creature's eyes with the towel, and whispered something in his ear. The alien slumped. Elias caught him before he fell, dragged him gently to the other side of the galley, and propped him beside the others. Not dead. Just paused. He had no intention of becoming what they were. That was the difference between his war and theirs. He wasn't trying to conquer. He was reclaiming dignity. And soon, command. With the galley quiet once more, Elias activated the emergency airflow vents to clear the air. The red lights dimmed to a low yellow as the system rebalanced. He moved quickly now, unlocking a hidden compartment beneath the sink where he'd been stashing his real ingredients. Not food, but raw components. Metal shavings. Energy packs from discarded tools. Tubing. A small data reader stolen from a careless mechanic's belt. And the blade. Just 5 inches of curved plating shaved from the inside of an exhaust vent and hardened in high heat. It looked like nothing. But in Elias's hands, it was a scalpel. He dragged a metal prep table across the door and bolted it in place with 2 skewers twisted into the hinge slots. He reinforced the walls with baking sheets, angled to reflect or absorb impact. He was building something now, not just cooking. Every piece of equipment in that room had been measured, tested, and stored in his mind like an ingredient list. He mapped the electrical outputs, the vent flows, the door timers. All of it. The galley wasn't a kitchen anymore. It was a fortress. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice echoed through the vents, demanding an explanation. Elias smiled, picked up the comm toggle with a pair of tongs, and spoke calmly. Maintenance issue. Smelled something burning. The captain barked something about inspections. Elias replied. Let me clean up. You wouldn't want a hygiene violation during your inspection, would you? There was silence, followed by a grunt, then the line went dead. He only had a few hours before they came knocking again. That was fine. He wasn't done prepping. At the back of the galley, Brelnak, the alien assistant chef, peeked from a small cupboard where he had hidden himself during the chaos. His eyes were wide, his voice trembling. You did all this alone? Elias looked at him and nodded. We cooked to survive. Sometimes literally. Brelnak hesitated, then crawled out and stood. I don't want to serve them anymore. Elias studied him. Then prove it. Peel 50 potatoes with your claws. Quietly. Brelnak didn't ask why. He just started peeling. Outside, the crew was assembling. The captain's patience was wearing thin. But inside the sealed galley, the revolution simmered. The chef had seized his kitchen. And the next course was war. Elias moved through the dim galley like a shadow with purpose, his every motion sharp and deliberate as he returned to the counter where Groktel lay unconscious. He knelt beside the alien's hulking body, checking his vitals, then muttered under his breath as he tied off the creature's arms with braided thermoplastic strips. He wasn't interested in killing any of them. Not yet. Dead enemies couldn't learn. But humiliated ones? They remembered every detail. He'd always said the secret to perfect seasoning was pressure, and now he was applying it to minds instead of meals. As he stood, the soft purring hum of the ship's systems filtered through the walls, a subtle reminder that he was still behind enemy lines. For all his control of the kitchen, the rest of the ship was still a floating prison with teeth. Brelnak had finished peeling the potatoes, and his claws were smeared with starch and guilt. He looked up at Elias like a student waiting for judgment. Elias said nothing at first, merely walked over and examined the pile of peels, then handed him a dull knife. Without a word, Brelnak understood the test wasn't over. Peeling was submission. Now came precision. Elias returned to the central prep station and started measuring. Not ingredients this time, but time. Time until the captain lost patience. Time until the vents shut down. Time until someone knocked with force instead of words. The ingredients had shifted, but the recipe had not. Timing was everything. He began his real work beneath the burners, removing the false bottom of the storage drawer to reveal a crude schematic he had etched in oil and ash. It wasn't elegant, but it was clear. It mapped out the galley's environmental controls, access hatches, drainage lines, and most importantly, the fire suppression tanks overhead. He had discovered months ago that their chemical composition was highly reactive with one of the alien spices he'd been stockpiling in secret. Not explosive, but corrosive. The kind of mix that could eat through boots, metal, or skin if deployed correctly. But it needed to be pressurized. For that, he required the backup water boiler behind the prep sink. It hadn't been used in weeks. That was good. It meant it was full. He took out a siphon tube and started rigging a line between the boiler and the spice chute. He had to work fast but quiet. Brelnock, still silently following instructions without receiving any, finished slicing the potatoes and stood nearby with a cautious look. Elias gestured at him without turning. "What's your access code?" The alien hesitated, then replied in a hoarse whisper. Elias nodded. "That'll get you into the cleaning bot storage?" Brelnock blinked, surprised. "Yes." Elias smirked and passed him a thin rod of metal. "Fetch the long-armed one with magnetic treads. I need its coolant array." Brelnock didn't ask why. He disappeared through the side door, careful not to trigger the sensor locks Elias had rewired earlier. Back in the galley, Elias turned his attention to Groktel. The big brute was beginning to stir, his breathing rough and throat gurgling with effort. Elias crouched beside him and whispered with calm authority. "You're not dead because I let you live. Think about that." Groktel tried to lunge, but the bindings held. Elias didn't flinch. He held up a container of soup. It wasn't drugged. Just warm, savory, and rich with flavor Groktel had once mocked. Elias placed it beside him. "Drink it. Not because you deserve it, but because I'm still human. And we feed even those who hate us." Then he turned away and went back to work. The galley door buzzed faintly. Someone was outside. A single tone. Not an alarm. Just a knock. Elias ignored it. If it were serious, they'd blast the door. This was still posturing. He let them posture. Meanwhile, he connected the final tube from the boiler to the overhead vent pipe, sealing the ends with resin gum from the waste containers. When it dried, it would be airtight. The pressure would build slowly. When released, it would rain down a chemical mist powerful enough to drop any unarmored creature in seconds. All triggered from a burner knob. Brelnock returned carrying the maintenance bot. Its arms sparked slightly from misuse, but its core was intact. Elias opened its lower panel and pulled the coolant coil, which he wired to the overhead panel with scavenged copper wire. With that, he had created a crude thermal trigger. If the room overheated from blaster fire or panic flammers, the coolant system would fail, and the chemical compound above would auto-release. It was brutal insurance, but necessary. He checked his work, every clamp, every wire, every sealed seam. Then he cleaned the counters. Not out of habit, but strategy. The guards who eventually entered would expect a mess. Instead, they'd find gleaming metal and silence. That alone would put them on edge. Perception was the seasoning of fear. When they feared, they'd make mistakes. The comm link buzzed again. This time, a voice. The captain, harsh and clipped. "Open this door, Earthling, or I will break it down myself." Elias didn't look up. He stirred a pot of stew with a calm hand and replied evenly. "That would be unwise. The soup is delicate. Would hate to see it ruined." The captain spat a threat, but Elias had already cut the line. Let him fume. Every minute he waited was another turn of the screw. He ladled the stew into small bowls, placed 4 on the counter, and waited. Behind him, Groktel shifted, not to fight, but to sit up straighter. Brelnak sat beside him. The two shared a glance. Elias didn't speak. He only handed them each a spoon and returned to the stove. Unity didn't require speeches. Just purpose. When the galley doors shook under pressure, Elias whispered softly, "Here we go." The pressure release valve clicked. The burner hissed. The game was no longer theoretical. The moment the doors opened, they'd smell what was cooking. And it wasn't just stew. It was a storm. A slow-cooked revolution. And the chef was just getting started. The galley was spotless. The scent of simmering beef stew mixed with the sharp tang of sterilized steel, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a high-end war banquet than a kitchen in open rebellion. Elias stood with his back to the sealed entrance, stirring the final pot with a measured rhythm. Every scrape of the ladle against the metal bottom was intentional, deliberate, controlled. Behind him, Groktel sat on a flipped crate, arms still bound, but his posture no longer hostile. Brelnak had stationed himself near the coolant line, monitoring pressure levels with the precision of a surgeon. There was no panic, no shouting, no scrambling. They were ready. Not to fight in the way soldiers fought, but to confront this invasion with something far sharper than weapons: control. When the outer blast doors finally unsealed with a shuddering hiss, Elias didn't flinch. He simply reached over, lowered the flame, and placed the lid on the stew pot. A moment later, the main galley door slid open, revealing a squad of heavily armored guards and the towering figure of the ship's captain, clad in ceremonial plating. The guards advanced cautiously, blasters raised, forming a perimeter as if expecting an ambush. The captain strode in after them, his cloak brushing the floor, his expression somewhere between disgust and amusement. Elias turned slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. His face was calm, his eyes unblinking. The captain sneered. "So, this is what rebellion looks like on Earth. A man with soup." The guards laughed, but the sound was uneasy. Nothing in the room made sense to them. No restraints on the chef. No chaos. Just clean surfaces and calm faces. Elias stepped aside and gestured toward the long table he had prepared at the center of the room. 4 seats. 4 bowls. Silverware polished to a gleam. The captain narrowed his eyes. "What is this?" Elias walked slowly to the head of the table. "Dinner. A sincere culinary truce. I thought your men could use a proper meal. One not squeezed from a nutrient bag or stamped from synthetic starch." The captain looked at his guards, then at Groktel and Brelnak, both sitting silently. "You expect me to eat with them?" Elias nodded. "If you don't, you'll never understand what you're about to lose." The guards raised their weapons, but the captain raised a clawed hand, silencing them. He stepped forward cautiously and examined the stew. He sniffed once, then again. There was something unfamiliar in the aroma, something almost nostalgic. He pulled out a chair and sat, eyes locked on Elias. The guards remained standing, uneasy. Elias sat too. He placed the small plate in front of the captain, lifting the cover to reveal a neatly folded beef Wellington, crust golden, juices glistening. A tiny data chip, no larger than a grain of salt, was embedded in the corner of the plate's rim. The captain noticed it but said nothing. Elias leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just food. It's a map. It's everything you ignored. Every vent I rerouted. Every sensor I redirected. Every guard rotation I tracked. The entire security failure of your ship, plated and served to you with a garnish of arrogance." The captain said nothing. He cut into the Wellington, eyes never leaving Elias. He chewed once. Then again. He swallowed slowly. "You laced it with poison?" Elias shook his head. "No. Just truth. Something your kind has a hard time digesting." The captain dropped his fork with a clang and stood. "You're bluffing." Elias turned the burner knob behind him. The room hissed as pressure shifted through the walls. The guards readied their weapons. The captain snarled. "This ship belongs to the Carvel Empire. You are a cook. A human. A primitive." Elias didn't move. Exactly. And yet you walked into my kitchen. One of the guards aimed a weapon and fired. A plasma bolt hit the ceiling and set off the failsafe. The lights snapped off for 2 seconds. When they returned, the guards' weapons were dead. The power packs inside had shorted out. The trigger had been rigged with modified sauce packets laced with conductive residue weeks earlier. The ship's own vents carried the particles into their chambers while they stood outside the door, laughing at his meals. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The captain's eyes widened as he looked around at the frozen guards, their dead weapons, and the cook with the apron. Brelnock stood slowly and held up the override codes he'd stolen from the maintenance bay. The codes that could reroute command functions directly through the galley's network. Elias rose and walked to the table, pulling out the chair beside the captain. You wanted submission. What you got was adaptation. You used this kitchen as a joke. But kitchens are war zones where fire and steel decide who walks out alive. The captain tried to lunge, but Groktel, unshackled moments earlier, stepped in front of him. His voice was low. I saw him fight. You'll lose. The captain froze. The sight of his own enforcer now guarding a human chef broke something inside him. A quiet realization. This wasn't rebellion. It was an evolution. Elias turned to the remaining guards. You can leave. Or you can join us. But either way, your captain is no longer in charge here. The guards looked at each other. Then one dropped his blaster. Another followed. Soon the room was filled not with tension, but with the slow, hesitant breaths of men realizing they weren't soldiers anymore. They were survivors. And Elias was their leader. The chef walked back to the burner, turned off the flame, and ladled a final bowl of stew. He set it down in front of the captain. Eat. Or don't. But know that from this moment forward, no one walks through that door without my permission. You don't control this ship. I do. The captain stared at the bowl, then at Elias. His hands clenched, unclenched, then slowly reached for the spoon. It shook as he lifted it. Outside the galley, no alarms sounded. No shots were fired. Just the quiet hiss of steam and the simmer of something ancient and powerful. Respect. Not demanded. Earned. And in the silence of that alien ship, a single truth echoed clear: never underestimate the man who feeds you. Because sometimes, he's the one preparing the end of your empire. The smell of stew lingered long after the tension faded. The guards who had entered the galley with weapons drawn were now seated against the walls, confused but no longer hostile. The captain had not spoken in minutes. He sat with the spoon still in his hand, the bowl in front of him untouched, his pride thicker than any broth. Elias moved silently through the room, checking seals, adjusting vents, and making subtle tweaks to the pressure valves. His hands worked out of habit, but his mind was already moving forward. The kitchen was secure. The captain was neutralized. But the rest of the ship was still enemy territory, and he wasn't foolish enough to believe one dinner could win a war. He needed to finish what he started, and this time, it wouldn't be with pots and ladles. It would be with strategy, with fire, with smoke and surrender. Brelnock approached with the data reader, its screen now glowing with the override sequence they had been preparing in secret. Elias nodded. With that code, the ship's central systems could be rerouted through auxiliary subsystems, many of which passed directly through the galley's backup circuits. A ridiculous oversight by the engineers, but one Elias had discovered months ago while fixing a fried grill unit. He turned to the remaining guards. This ship is going to change hands. You can either help run it or get out of the way. But if you raise another weapon in my kitchen, I will personally serve your lungs in a casserole. The message was clear. So was the tone. No threats, just certainty. He moved toward the main control access embedded in the wall beside the dry storage unit. It had been placed there for emergencies, never meant to be accessed by a cook, but Elias had already bypassed its secondary locks weeks ago using the melted tip of a thermometer. He tapped the console. The screen flared. System access code required. He turned to Brelnock. The alien stepped forward, entered the string of commands, and watched as the screen shifted to a new interface. Ship-wide systems slowly blinked to life. Ventilation, lighting, interior doors, communications, all flowing through the galley now. Elias accessed the internal cameras. The hallways were clear. The rest of the crew must have been waiting for a direct order from their now silent captain. Elias smirked. He clicked the intercom and let the signal broadcast across the ship. His voice was calm, quiet, almost casual. "This is Elias Ward. Cook. Former prisoner. Current commander of this kitchen. If you're still loyal to the captain, you should probably stay in your quarters. If you're hungry and sick of eating out of plastic tubes, the galley is now open." He paused, then added, "And bring a mop. Things got messy." Then he cut the feed. Groktel stood, rubbing his wrists where the bonds had been. He looked at Elias for a long moment, then walked to the door. "I'll go to the armory. There are others there. They'll listen to me." Elias simply nodded. No commands were needed. Trust had already been earned. Groktel left with heavy steps, not like a soldier marching to battle, but like a man returning to a duty he finally believed in. Brelnak stayed, eyes focused on the console. "What if they try to take the ship back?" Elias replied without looking up. "Then we close the vents and turn up the heat." He activated the secondary boiler systems, rerouting steam pressure to the corridor ducts. It wouldn't hurt anyone, but it would fog the hallways and make movement difficult. He wasn't interested in casualties. Just discomfort. Enough to make people question their loyalty. Confusion was a powerful weapon when wielded in silence. Hours passed. One by one, crew members arrived. Some came with hands raised. Others came with tools, weapons left behind. They were tired. Hungry. Curious. Elias fed them. Simple meals. Hot bread, roasted roots, thick soup made from ration scraps and seasoned with patience. He didn't give speeches. He served bowls and let silence do the convincing. More than half the ship's support crew had defected by morning. The remaining soldiers stayed locked in their bunks, waiting for orders that never came. Eventually, the captain stood. He walked to the table, set the spoon down, and faced Elias. His voice was hoarse. "You won't hold this ship. Eventually, someone will come. Someone bigger. They always do." Elias didn't argue. He poured a mug of coffee and handed it to the captain. "Then let them come. I'll be in the kitchen." The captain stared at him, at the apron still tied, at the calm fire behind his eyes, and then, without a word, turned and walked away. Brelnak watched him go. "What will you do with him?" Elias replied. "Feed him. Keep him under watch. And let him think. That's worse than any cell." The console pinged. A transmission was coming through. Not from within the ship, but from a nearby patrol vessel. The signal was weak, garbled, but unmistakable. A request for status. A demand for report. Elias stared at the screen, then at the steaming coffee in his hand. He tapped the mic. "This is Commander Ward. The narc hull is secure. Captain is recovering. Systems are stable. Kitchen is operational." He didn't wait for a reply. He ended the call and turned to Brelnak. "That'll confuse them." By the end of the cycle, the ship's hierarchy had flipped. Elias wasn't a cook anymore. He was the nerve center. The decision maker. The one everyone looked to when something broke, or someone panicked, or someone needed a reason not to fire a weapon. He didn't demand the role. He didn't even ask for it. He just made food, held the line, and turned his kitchen into the only place on the ship where people felt human. Or at least something close to it. As he stood at the galley window, watching stars drift past, a junior technician approached, shifting nervously. "Sir, what should we call the ship now?" Elias looked around, thought for a long second, then smiled. "The Friar." The technician blinked. "Like the kitchen?" Elias nodded. "Exactly like the kitchen. Hot, chaotic, and full of surprises." He untied his apron and set it gently on the counter. For the first time since he had been captured, He took a deep breath with no fear of what came next. The galaxy was still out there, full of empires and enemies and things bigger than any single person. But now they knew something important. A lesson burned into the walls of that ship. Sometimes, the cook is the one who decides who gets to eat. And who gets burned.